Hello and welcome to the session with Shawn Andrews, our Overcoming Hidden Biases workshop. So thank you for joining us today. I'm going to introduce Shawn Andrews to you. It's a little bit of an introduction, so bear with me. She deserves every bit of the introduction she can get. So Shawn Andrews is a keynote speaker, organizational consultant, business school professor, and author of the best-selling book, The Power of Perception, Leadership, Emotional Intelligence, and Gender Divide. If you do not have that book, I highly recommend that you get it. So she is a Forbes contributor. She's been quoted in the Chicago Tribune and interviewed on dozens of podcasts and radio shows, including NPR. She speaks for a diverse range of clients across industries and has over 2 decades of corporate experience in the biopharmaceutical industry. She serves as a professor at both UC Irvine and Pepperdine business schools, teaching courses on women and leadership, organizational behavior, diversity in organizations, and leadership and ethics. Dr. Shawn Andrews earned her degree in organizational leadership from Pepperdine University, an MBA degree from Pepperdine, and a BA degree in psychology from University of California, Irvine. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Shawn Andrews. Thank you for joining us, Shawn.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you very much. All right, can you hear me? Is my audio coming through okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, excellent. So welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. So this topic today is overcoming hidden biases that hinder our success. And it's a topic that's based on my doctoral dissertation research, and also the book that Jackie just mentioned is in there. So I study this extensively, and I'd have to say this is one of the my most popular topics that I'm giving right now. Understandably, given that it's been such a tumultuous year, and with racial tensions and everything else, this has definitely become a topic of interest. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So today we're going to talk about exploring the what, why, and how of bias, examine the impact of bias at work, discuss case studies to explore potential biases. So we're actually going to work through a couple bias scenarios and apply a bias framework, and also individual and organizational strategies. So, okay. So first of all of you were asked to do some pre-work, and the pre-work included a couple short videos, as well as the implicit association test through Harvard. So as you probably realized, there's 15 different tests in there, and you are welcome to take any one, but you were asked to take at least one of those tests. So what's interesting about this assessment is it's the only assessment out there that gives us a sense of personal biases that we may have. And in a meta-analysis done 10 years ago of 15,000 people, they found that the implicit association test was moderately related to predicting future judgments and behavior. So take that with a grain of salt, but there is a moderate relation, but it's also the only test out there for personal biases. So, okay, we're going to start right off with a poll based on that. I'm going to go ahead and launch the first poll question here. Okay, so the question is, based on your preferred implicit association test, I think I have a slide here on this. Yes, it says the same thing. Based on your preferred test, so the preferred test that you took, if you took more than one, just pick whichever one is your preferred. How was your score labeled compared to the subject? So no implicit preference, so meaning there was no biases at all, a slight implicit preference towards the subject, a moderate implicit preference, or a strong implicit preference. Okay, so it looks like they're bouncing all over the place. That's good. Okay, and I'll give it just a few more seconds here to go ahead. So again, if you may have taken multiple, but generally what people pick as their first one is the one they're most interested in. So if you want to think of that test, think of the results for that one. Okay, I'll go ahead and check chat here. Okay, so let's go ahead. I'm just responding to a text. Okay, excellent. So let's go ahead and launch the poll so you can see the results. Okay, so hopefully you can see this on your screen. It looks like half of you, and we have over 100 people on the line, half of you showed a slight implicit preference, which means potentially a slight bias. And it looks like it's split fairly evenly between no implicit preference or a moderate implicit preference. And it looks like only about 15% of you actually showed a strong preference. So again, take it with a grain of salt. And I have to tell you, when I've taken these dozens of times, and I research leadership and gender, as many of you may know, and there's 2 tests on gender. And when I took those tests, I showed a moderate or strong association against, like I associated men in the workplace with women at home. How depressing is that? Even knowing the data and diving into it, knowing the data, I still showed a preference as well. So it just gives you a glimpse of things that may be unconscious or blind spots for us to be aware of. Okay, so again, and I'm sorry about that. I see that you can't see that. Now you should be able to see the results there. So again, about half of you showed a slight implicit preference. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and stop that, and I'll move to the next question. Okay, so what is bias? Bias is a deep-seated resistance to the different, any type of different, basically different from us. Here's the formal definition. It's unintended, subtle, and completely unconscious preferences for or against a person, thing, or group. Now, the terms unconscious, hidden, and implicit all mean the same thing, and they're used interchangeably. So just know that when someone says hidden biases or unconscious biases or implicit, it's all the same thing. So these are the unintended, subtle biases for or against a person, thing, or group. We don't see as much of the overt biases today that we used to, let's say back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in the workplace. It doesn't mean bias doesn't exist, but it's now more subtle. So I'll give you an example. One of the women I interviewed in my research shared with me that she used to work at an aerospace company, a male-dominated company. And when she would walk down the hallway, the men in their cubicles would have naked pictures, Playboy pinups actually, of women just right out in their cubicles, just pinned up. And she recalls walking down the hallway and just seeing these, and it was commonplace. And nowadays, hold on, I'm getting questions I have to respond to. But nowadays, you would not see that. I mean, we would be shocked if you saw that. But again, biases is still there. It's just subtle. Now, we do have positive biases as well. So, for example, those of you who are on the line, think of your children. So some of you have children, obviously. Are your children the best children in the world? Of course they are, right? Of course they're the best children in the world. So that's an example of a positive biases. Also, if you have a favorite sports team or you're a sports fan, that's an example of a positive bias. But when it comes to the workplace, biases are particularly problematic. And here's why. So why are we biased? Here we are, 2020, 21st century, and why are we talking about this still? It's because our brains are wired towards bias. And we make general assumptions about people, objects, things, and a lightning fast response. So for example, if you're this little girl and you see a bear running at you, you don't stop and think, what kind of bear is that? I wonder if the bear is hungry. What does the bear eat? You don't do those things, right? You turn and you run. So this is your fight or flight mechanism kicking in. Now, for survival, it's an excellent mechanism where we see something, we size it up in milliseconds, and we take action. But our brain actually works against us when it comes to people because we overlook the subtle, more important distinctions in people. and the nuances in people. The other reason that our brains are wired towards bias is that our old caveman brain used to believe that we had to be surrounded by people who look like us to feel safe. We now know that is not the case. And actually the data shows just the opposite. You don't have to be around people that look and act just like you to be safe. We actually know that diverse groups and teams are actually more productive, more innovation, more creativity. So we know that we've evolved since our caveman days. So here's the bottom line to take away from this is bias is habitual. We get into these patterns where we're sizing people up and we're making assumptions about people right away, but it's not inevitable. And that's a really key point. It's habitual, but it's not inevitable. The habitual part is it's the shortest mental route to making a decision. So for example, when it comes to race, within 120 milliseconds of seeing someone who may be of a different race, we're already making assumptions. So, but the good news is it's not inevitable, and there are things we can do that we're going to discuss today to interrupt that process. So let's go ahead and press on. So as I was saying here, our brains are wired towards bias. And it's great when it comes to fight or flight, but it works against us because we dismiss the subtle, more important distinctions in people. So this is a pyramid that's actually stumbled across it recently, and I think it's a great illustration of how bias fits into the big picture. So this is from the Anti-Defamation League, and it's called the Pyramid of Hate. So at the bottom of the pyramid, you have biased attitudes. So what this pyramid is it's escalating levels of attitudes and behavior that grow in complexity from bottom to the top. So the upper levels, and we'll just walk through it as a group together. So let's start at the bottom. So biased attitudes. So this includes stereotyping, fears of differences, trying to justify our beliefs and biases, seeking like-minded people would be in this category. Perhaps lack of self-reflection or not being aware of privilege, our own privilege that we may have. So these are all examples of biased attitudes, and they're incredibly prevalent and pervasive, as we'll talk about today. So the next level up from that escalates to acts of bias. So this includes bullying, non-inclusive language, insensitive remarks, microaggressions, which are everyday signals that we send to people as to whether they're part of the in-group or out-group. It includes jokes, things like that. It could also include social avoidance, dehumanization, slurs, or epithets. That escalates to systemic discrimination. So this includes discrimination in criminal justice, in housing, in pay, how school resources are distributed, inequitable employment opportunities. Voter suppression is actually in this category as part of systemic discrimination, and unequal media representation. So those are examples of that category. The next level up is bias motivated violence, which is threats, vandalism, arson, assault, murder, terrorism. And then at the top of the pyramid is genocide, which is the act or intent of deliberately and systematically annihilating an entire people. So I want to read you a quote here from the Anti-Defamation League. They say, while every biased attitude or act does not lead to genocide, each genocide has been built on the acceptance of attitudes and actions described at the lower levels of the pyramid. When we challenge those biased attitudes and behaviors in ourselves, in others, and in our institutions, we can interrupt this escalation of bias. So that's a really important point here with the pyramid of hate. So this is why organizations are spending so much time on presentations just like this. Bias, doing workshops, the bias assessment that you all took, it's because it's at the baseline. It's the foundation of the pyramid of hate. Okay, so types of biases. So you may have heard some of these. Let's just do a quick review. So priming bias is when exposure to a stimulus, such as words or images, subconsciously influences response to later stimulus. For example, the implicit association test is an example of a priming bias. They showed you a word or an image, And then they timed your response to that and measured how quick your response was. And the premise is the longer it took you to respond, then that could indicate potential biases. So that actually was an example of priming bias. Selection bias occurs when information is selected subjectively. Now, some of you may have seen the video. There's actually several versions of it now, but it's been around for years. It's a video of a group of people, and they have a basketball, and they're asked to bounce the basketball to each other, and you're supposed to count the number of bounces. Now, in the middle of this bouncing, a guy in a gorilla suit walks across the group, stands in the middle, does a little wave, and keeps walking. Now, what's fascinating is most people do not even see the gorilla. They don't see the gorilla that just walked across the screen because they're too busy counting the bounces. So that's an example of selection bias, where we actually are looking to select certain pieces of information and we miss other pieces. Okay, so diagnosis bias is labeling or diagnosing people based on perception. So that's putting them in a box. Availability bias is tendency to base judgments on information that's readily available. So an example there could be, let's take a religion. Let's take Muslim, for example. If the knowledge, biases against people who are Muslim may be based on information that's readily available. You may know a few, 2 or 3 key characteristics, but don't dig deeper to find out more about that. And that applies to any bias. I'm just using Muslim as an example here. But we tend to base our judgments just on information that's readily available and in the media that we can easily find. We often don't dig deeper. So that's what availability bias is. And then confirmation bias, we have a tendency to seek information that reaffirms past beliefs and discounts new information. So we're looking for information that just confirms our current beliefs, and we don't want to hear anything that goes against that. So these are all incredibly common types of biases that we experience. So there's another type called affinity bias. So this is favoring our family, community, or people we're connected to based on shared characteristics or experiences. So this could be your own friends and family. It could be a neighbor. It could be someone who you wouldn't have the same alma mater with. Could be someone you go to the same church with. So people whom we have a common bond, we tend to favor them. So let's take an example. So let's say, let's just take Jackie for an example. So let's say Jackie's neighbor comes to her and says, Jackie, my son just graduated from college. Can you get him a job at your company? So let's say, being a good neighbor, Jackie says, sure. So she takes his resume and she happens to know of a position in a company that's available. So she passes on his resume to the hiring manager in that company or in her company. Let's say he gets the job. And then he serves his first year, gets promoted, he's well on his way to his career. Now, just that simple act of passing that resume on by being a good neighbor is an example of affinity bias. So what happened is that created a subtle advantage for that young man. And also it bypassed the normal hiring process. So let's say, she knew of someone else, she just passed the resume on. There could have been a whole host of other candidates that were equal, if not more qualified than he was. But he got the job, right? Because he had an in, if you will. So subtle advantages often lead to other subtle advantages. That leads to unequal opportunities. And then pretty soon, you're limiting diversity and maintaining the status quo. That's the problem with affinity bias. And so I want to bring this up because it's an incredibly common type of bias. Favoring people whom we have a common bond, but it absolutely works against diversity because we tend to favor people whom look like us, that are in our own circles. So my suggestion to you is challenge yourself to resist the urge of these natural affinities, of these common bonds. So talent in our world is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. So, and I love the quote because it's so pertinent to this topic, is we all have talent, all different types of talent, but the opportunity to express that talent is not equal. Okay, so let's talk about diversity at work. Now I have here in the slides and bias. The reason I put bias here is because when you have increased levels of diversity, you also have the potential for more biases. So let me ask you, we're going to go ahead and use chat now. What are the common types of biases that you see at work or that you've experienced or observed? So what are some of the common types? And I'll give you a hint, there's a whole host, there's a whole list of them. But what are some of the common ones that you're aware of? Okay, age, absolutely. Age, by the way, is on the rise. And the reason for that is older workers are staying in the workplace longer now. They're not retiring. So they're staying around. And then we have huge numbers of millennials and Gen Z that's just entered the workforce. So age biases is on the rise. So I see a lot of gender coming up. Absolutely. Gender bias is incredibly prevalent. Race, yep, race and ethnicity, that's kind of in the same category. Suzanne says appearance bias, so how someone looks, absolutely. What else? Cultural backgrounds, physical appearance. Anything else? Or you're missing some big ones. Religion, education bias, absolutely. So depending on the industry you're in, so in this case, all electronics, having certain degrees may be preferred in certain roles, right? And so there might be biases against people who don't have those degrees or those that level of education. Political biases, Linda, yes. We're going to talk about that's certainly relevant right now. Accents, yes, I would say accents goes along with cultural. Seniority bias, Sharon, that's an excellent one. So perhaps based on tenure or title in a company, you know, there could be biases there. Ability or disability biases, socioeconomic. Okay, fantastic. So let's go ahead and look at the list here. Now, this is not an all-inclusive list, but it is the most common ones that we see. So race, ethnicity, you mentioned, gender, age, disabilities, religion. I also saw culture, you mentioned culture. Height, weight, introverts, we're going to talk about a few of these. Let's look at height for a moment. So, did you know we had a height bias? So what the bias is we naturally look to taller people as leaders, naturally. And I'll give you an example. That's highly relevant. This is a study out of Princeton. In every single US presidential election, the taller candidate has won, with the exception of one. There's one exception to that rule. So in every single US presidential election, the taller candidate has won. Does anyone want to guess what that one is? And I'll give you a hint. It's not what's going on right now. Yeah. Bruno said Biden. Yes. I'm going to comment on that in a moment. Bush. Which Bush? Hooray for tall people. Nope, not Bush Sr. I'll give you a hint. It was the year 2000. Junior, you got it. Okay, I see several juniors coming up. Yes, George W. Bush is shorter than Al Gore. Al Gore was the taller candidate. Now, there is a second exception I would add to this. Joe Biden is actually shorter than Donald Trump. So there's been two exceptions now. So this study that was done doesn't have current day, of course. And it goes back about 30, 40 years. But it's fascinating that we do look at people who are taller. So if you have a 6'4" individual standing in the front of a room, and you have a 5'2" individual standing in the front of the room, male or female, we naturally look to the taller person as a leader. Now, is that true? Are short people not leaders? Absolutely not. But it's a very common biases that we hold, and often it's a subconscious, unconscious bias. Weight bias. We tend to have prejudices or biases against people who are heavier. We often assume, well, perhaps they're lazy, or they're not ambitious, or they don't care about themselves. That's not the case at all. Introverts. Did you know we have biases against introverts? You probably did, especially if you tend to have introverted preferences yourself. So we often look to people who are introverted and think, well, they just don't have anything to contribute, or they don't, have any insights, or they don't want to speak up. They don't want to be, maybe they're not, we don't see them as a team player. Again, those are based on biases. And I have to tell you, in my corporate experience, 20 years of experience, some of the best managers I have been introverts, because introverts sit back and they listen and they observe and they think, and then they make decisions. So it's absolutely a bias that we tend to have against introverts there. Sexual orientation, gender identity, very common. Experience bias, someone who's experienced in their career versus perhaps just exiting college, entering their first career. Socioeconomic status, and the pregnancy and children, of course. So this bias is overwhelmingly affects women, of course, but it can affect men too. So if an individual has small children at home, the assumption is, well, she's not going to want to take on a special assignment or travel because of her children. But the women that I've interviewed, I found just the opposite. Many of the women want the special assignment because it gives them a break. So bottom line here is we shouldn't make assumptions about either men or women if they have small children at home. So, okay, let me just take a quick check chat here. Okay, someone said Donald Trump is 6'2", so thank you for looking that up. Yeah, and I think Joe Biden is 6 foot, so there's a height difference there. So, okay, we'll go ahead and press on here. So there's also something else contributing to bias in the workplace, and it's a cycle that I find virtually nobody is aware of. It's called the ASA cycle, and what it stands for is attraction, selection, attrition. So here's how this works. Attraction is individuals are attracted to organizations that appear to have members with similar values to their own values. Okay, so they're attracted to that company, and then they want to apply because it seems to have similar members. The selection piece is organizations select new members who are like existing members because hiring continues to make everyone comfortable. The attrition piece is employees who do not fit in with the dominant culture eventually leave, or perhaps they get fired, creating a selective attrition process that supports and maintains homogeneity. So attraction, selection, attrition. This is an incredibly powerful process, and I'll just go back a slide here, that perpetuates homogeneity in the workforce. So it's also, this cycle is also the reason that many organizations look for fit in hiring. And I'll put that in air quotes here for you, fit. So in your companies, think about this. Do you hire based on fit? Is fit one of the criteria you use in your own company? I'm assuming it is, and for many of you. It's become very common in the last 10 years or so. So here's the problem with fit, is what is fit based on? So what are you looking for with fit? It's often a nebulous term. Employers may say, well, make sure they're a fit for the company, but we don't define what fit is. What are you looking for exactly? So the problem with it is it's a nebulous term. It's often not defined. And it's also, it's subjective. So it's based on biases. And the other problem with fit is once they're hired, how do you measure that they're a good fit for the company? Most people don't measure fit. I actually have not heard anybody give me a response on how they measure fit in a company. But yet it's such a common term. It's such a common criteria that we're looking for. So fit causes us to be biased in favor of the dominant workforce and biased against anyone who doesn't fit that mold. And also in the long run, it limits the talent pool, long-term growth, and the ability of the company to adapt to new changes and tap new markets. I'll just give you a real-world example of fit here. Let's take a tech company. Let's take Google. So Google has spent over $200 $65 million in unconscious bias training for their managers. And they're the dominant workforce in tech companies in general, including electronic companies. The dominant workforce is generally Asian and Caucasian men. So if you're an African-American female, let's say engineer, looking to get a job at Google, you're not going to match the dominant workforce. So automatically, so if Google is looking for fit or looking for a candidate to match their dominant workforce, she is not going to match that because she doesn't fit in with that dominant workforce. So looking for fit actually introduces more bias into the equation and causes us to perhaps overlook candidates who would have been a great selection for that company. We just overlook them because they don't fit that dominant workforce, and they continue with hiring that makes everyone feel comfortable. So it's a really powerful mechanism that's at play within the fabric of an organization, and oftentimes we're completely unaware of it. Okay, and then the final point with bias is that it impacts how we make decisions and how we interact with each other. That's the real problem with it. And it affects virtually every aspect of an organization, from how we recruit and hire to our performance evaluations and our compensation. Who gets paid what? What salary are you getting? Who's getting promoted? Who's in discussions about succession planning? Bias is part of that process. Our team and project assignments. So again, who gets the special assignments? How about budget decisions? Who's going to get the discretionary spend or the extra additional budget this year? Bias is part of that process. Openness to new sources of ideas and innovative solutions. Bias impacts that. So, and we know that companies that actually have less diversity have less innovation and creativity. And then even client or customer service is impacted. And I'll just give you, a non-technology example here with the client or customer service is smog check centers. You know, the drive-in, you get a smog check in your car, you drive out. So a study was done in hundreds of smog check centers. And what they found is the smog operator, what they tended to do is when people drove in and they drove cars that looked like them, cars like, you know, that looked like them, and the cars were similar to the cars they drove, they would pass those cars more often. So the example that was given in this study is that people that would come in and let's just say Mercedes and higher level cars, those cars were not getting a pass rating as often as the cars that were similar to the smog operators. So even I mean, and this is pervasive in every single industry, but even something as simple as a smog check, whether your car passes or fails, bias is in that process. And it was shown in the number of cars that actually got passed versus failed. So so it's pervasive, and which is why we're talking about it today. Okay, so I'm just going to stop here and just see if there are any questions on any of this, and then we're going to get into the bias scenarios. Okay, I don't see any right now. So, all right, so let's jump into the bias scenarios. So what we're going to do here is we're going to utilize both polling and chatting to have a scenario. So I'm going to read you a common scenario, and I'll ask you to share what potential issues are in the scenario, and then I'll ask you a poll question after that. Okay, everyone ready? Here's the first scenario. Now you might want to take, well, you actually don't have to take notes because we're not going into breakout rooms, but I'll go ahead and read you the scenario. You and a colleague are jointly interviewing candidates for an open position on your team. You've narrowed it down to 2 final candidates. One candidate is South American and looks to be in her late 40s, while the other candidate is Caucasian and in his mid-20s. The older candidate has experience that you think you need for the role. Before the interview, your colleague makes a joke about her and her country, stating that She might be a partier because of Carnival. She strongly advocates for the Caucasian candidate because she thinks he would be a better fit with the team. Now, there might be more than one issue going on here or more than one bias. So the question for you is, what are the potential issues or biases that you see in this scenario? So let's go ahead and utilize chat. What jumps out at you? What do you think might be at play here? Okay, so perhaps age, okay, race, I see nationality, culture, age, race, perhaps experience bias. That's what Paulina said that. Ethnic bias, cultural. Stereotyping, absolutely. Jamie says gender, Toby, age, and culture. The South American may also be Caucasian. That's an excellent point, Toby. That's right. South America is actually quite diverse. So that, and actually that could be part of the scenario. I actually never considered that, but yeah, that actually could absolutely apply. Okay, nationality, culture, and experience. Okay, those are all good. So let's go ahead. So given the scenario, so given that race are stereotypes against race, age could be a factor. You have late 40s versus mid 20s. You have perhaps diagnosis biases could be another one at play here, because the person is being labeled as a partier. So you're pigeonholing them as a partier because of Carnival. What do you think about fit? So you have a potential fit issue, and she actually says that. She favors the Caucasian candidate because she thinks he's a better fit. Gender, cultural. Okay, absolutely. So let's take a look at, I'm going to go to a poll question now. Okay, so here's the poll. Let me go ahead and launch this. Okay, here's the first poll question. It's launching. Okay, what would you do to address the situation? So put yourself here, you're actually interviewing candidates, you've narrowed it down to 2, you have the scenario at hand. How many of you would not say anything? Perhaps you would talk to your colleague before the interview. You'd have a discussion with her. Talk to your colleague after the interview. So maybe you would wait and then say something afterwards. Perhaps you could talk to your supervisor or HR about the comment. So some of you might do that. You might think it's more appropriate to do that. And then perhaps if you wouldn't do any of those, but there's something else you would do. So I'll give you a few seconds to think about this. And so it looks like also there's a couple of chats that also look like they would talk to the supervisor. Okay. I'll give you a few more seconds here. And they're all very plausible, right? But we might do different things. Some of you probably wouldn't say anything, given the setting, perhaps given who your colleague is, maybe you don't say anything. Depends on your comfort level. Okay, so I'll go ahead and launch the poll results so you could see it here. Okay, so overwhelmingly, it looks like 63% of you would talk to your colleague before the interview. Okay, that's great. That's fantastic. Looks like almost a quarter of you, 22%, would talk to your colleague after the interview. So you might wait and then say something to her afterwards. About 10% of you would perhaps go to a supervisor or HR about the comment. 3% would maybe do something else. And then it looks like one person right now wouldn't say anything. And again, it does depend on the situation. So this scenario is intentionally meant to be a little gray. And it's not black and white, because often with biases are not often black and white. They're often kind of gray areas. Okay, so Okay. So someone says they can't see the poll results. Hopefully you should be able to see that up there. But anyways, vast majority of you would talk to your colleague before the interview. Okay, so let's discuss this a bit. I'm going to go ahead and stop the polling. So first of all, and we're going to keep using chat here, is this an appropriate comment, do you think? Now, something to think about is it appropriate in an interview setting? Would this be appropriate if you were in a casual setting, perhaps not an interview setting, but you just heard your colleague say this comment just in general, generally in the workplace? So that's the first question: is do you think this is an appropriate comment? Let's see. No way. Nope. Okay, inappropriate. Okay, somebody say, okay. Interesting. Sometimes I get people that do say, maybe it depends. Depends on the setting. Again, perhaps if you're in a casual setting, but it looks like actually everybody who's chiming in right now doesn't think it's appropriate. And then in an interview setting, absolutely inappropriate as well. I also had one person say one time, well, what's wrong with partying? It's not meant to be a negative connotation on partying itself, but that's not the issue. The issue here, this comment was made against the candidate. Okay, another question for you is, so I asked you, would you say something? Majority of you would say something. We talked about fit, that it's subjective, it's not defined, and we often can't measure it. Let me see here. Okay, anything for those of you answered other, what would you do? I'm just curious, what other actions would you take in this scenario? So maybe you don't say anything before, I would have removed her from the interview panel. Okay, Linda says that. So yeah, that's another option, is perhaps have another interviewer come in and not her. That's a good one. Anything else that anyone would do in this scenario other than these options here? As soon as the comment is made, discuss openly among the group. Okay, so it looks like Mark would address it right then with the whole group. Okay, fantastic. Paul says, I'd ask her to explain her motive for stating the comment. Okay. Linda, it's too important. The interview process and a quick conversation cannot alter the bias. And Ellen asked for more details about why she thinks the other candidate is a better fit. Okay, fantastic. So those are good ones. Let's look at some strategies. So what could you do here? So one of the things you could do is joint in structured interviews. So oftentimes bias is first introduced actually in the job description itself. And there's some data out there that shows that the language that's used in job descriptions either can turn off, men, women, or people of color based on the language used. And I think there are actually applications out there that can help monitor and correct job descriptions. I can't remember the name of it, but I think there's an app that does that. So there could be bias in the language in the job description, but the interview itself, even more bias is introduced, because as soon as that candidate walks in the door, what are we doing? Remember the little girl running from the bears? That's what happens. Lightning fast, we're sizing them up, we're making assumptions. So we may say, oh, she's similar age to I am, or a similar race. Oh, I see on her resume we have a similar background. We went to the same school. So we're automatically making connections. Our brain just does this, right? Our brain makes these mental shortcuts. But one way to get around this is to have joint interviews. So instead of a series of single interviews, have a panel of interviewers. That's a great way to help minimize bias. Another example is make sure they're structured. Make sure you each have the same template you're working off of, and that you debrief afterwards. That actually will help remove biases. You could have competency-based standards for hiring. So you can have a rubric, again, that you're all working off the same rubric, and you're looking for certain competencies and nothing else. You're just hiring based on competencies. That, believe it or not, most companies do not have that. So it's something that absolutely works, and it's well worth the effort and the time to put together competency-based standards. Call out potential race biases to your colleague and ask her to clarify the statement. One of you alluded to this. So you could say, Sue, how do you mean that comment? It could be interpreted as derogatory and affect how others view this candidate. Let's focus on the impact of the comment rather than the intention. So impact and intention is really important when it comes to bias and when it comes to inclusion in general. So oftentimes, if someone makes a statement like this, what could be considered a derogatory statement, and if you call them on it, how do they respond? Usually they say, oh, I didn't mean it that way, right? Most people, if not all people, when you call them on a comment, they'll say, oh, I didn't mean that. So when it comes to bias, so actually this is a type of microaggression. A comment like this it's a derogatory comment, type of a microaggression. The intention is not as important as the impact on the person. So intention, so impact supersedes intention when it comes to bias, because of the impact on the person, whether it was intended that way or not. So that's a really important point to make to the other party here, that it's not about their intention, it's about the impact that the comment had on the person. And also part of the discussion is, if you ask them to clarify their intent, actually I did see a comment that someone would ask, what's behind this comment? Ask them to clarify intent and hope they appreciate your willingness to clarify the impact that it had. Also, the impact could affect how other people view this candidate, right? So if you have a group and someone else heard this comment, that comment could impact their perceptions of this person. So the downstream impact absolutely is more important than what the initial intention was. Another thing you could do is challenge that concept of fit. So you might want to say, Sue, what competencies does he have that makes you feel he's the best person for the role? Let's challenge ourselves to select candidates that bring diverse perspectives to the team. So just a simple verbiage there that you could use. Now, anything else? What else would you say that we haven't talked about? Let's see. Anything else anyone would do in this situation? Okay, another question for you. Do we always hire the best candidates? Okay, I see some no's coming in. Unfortunately not. No, probably not. Okay, Katie. We try. Glinda, absolutely, we do try. I would say most companies try. I'm getting a lot of we try, but no, we don't hire the best candidate. So the reason I asked the question is just because I want you to think about this for a moment, is most people think that we think that we do hire the best candidates for the role most of the time. That is absolutely a fallacy. The reason it's a fallacy is because we don't live in a meritocracy. We do not. We would like to live in a meritocracy. So what I mean by this is a meritocracy is when everybody is judged solely based on their merits, their accomplishments, their competencies, and they're hired only on that. But unfortunately what happens is bias creeps into the equation in the form of gender bias, in the form of age bias, in the form of race, ethnicity, LGBT, everything we've talked about already. So we oftentimes think we live in a meritocracy, but we do not. And that's a really, really important concept. This is exactly the reason that we do not hire the best people for the role. We often think it is, but but we need to also challenge ourselves to look beyond just our initial impressions and our initial assumptions, because of the fact that we don't live in a meritocracy and because we know that bias is at play. So that's a really important point to keep in mind there. Okay, so great. Thanks for the great discussion. Let's take another scenario. Okay, love that point. Katie, thank you. Or Carrie, I love that point. Okay, so we're going to move on to another scenario, a different scenario. Okay, so here we go. This one's called Equal Voices. You're in a meeting with your team and teams from other departments discussing issues for a recently launched initiative. The goal is to create solutions to address problems that have arisen. A female on your team suggests a solution that has not been tried before. Her suggestion goes largely unacknowledged by the group. 10 minutes later, a male on another team suggests the same solution using different words. Several people comment and praise the suggestion as something that should be explored further. Okay, so the question for you, and again, we're going to use chat. The question is, what are the potential issues or biases at play here? And again, there might be things that are at play that other than what's obvious. All right, so let's see what you think. Okay, I'm seeing lots of genders coming in, totally gender. Experience bias, that could be a communication bias. That's a good one, Tammy. Confidence, Jennifer says there could be a confidence issue going on here. Absolutely. Gender, maybe age. Someone else getting credit for the idea, yes. Janny, looks like Janny says communication in all caps. What else? Personality. Good one, Jamie. You could have a personality differences here at play. Different way to propose. So I'm guessing that maybe the way the solution was brought up. Maybe someone else proposed it a different way, in a different word. Presence. Okay, perhaps presence of the person. Presence or lack of presence. Hi. Someone says hi. I don't know if hi would apply here. Okay, someone may be in a lower position, so you may have hierarchy issues going on, right? That absolutely could be in this situation. I actually wrote this scenario purposely to be a little vague, because again, in the real world, it's always vague. It's usually gray, and we don't have absolute black and white usually. Anytime we're dealing with people, it's usually gray. Confidence. You may not want to be the first to agree with something, but when it's suggested the second time, it doesn't sound so unheard of, okay? So maybe give them more credence to the second time it was brought up, okay? Those are excellent, excellent. Sometimes it takes the team a while to process. Okay, you might have that going on too. So many of you right off the bat said gender bias. So absolutely, gender bias could be at play here. Matter of fact, this is a global phenomenon, and there's actually, when women's voices simply aren't heard, particularly in meetings, there's actually a name for it. It's called unintentional invisible bias, and it's when women's voices simply are not heard. Again, unintentional invisible bias is the name of that. So this type of bias is a shared global experience for women, and and it doesn't matter what level you're at, from president, CEO, all the way down to administrative assistant. Women have this shared experience. Now, men can also experience this scenario. You could have, perhaps you're early in your career, you're younger, you're inexperienced, perhaps what you say gets disregarded. And sometimes people of color, this also can occur to. But in particularly for women, it tends to be a shared global experience. So you got that. Now there could be, someone mentioned personality. So you could have introvert. Perhaps the person who brought it up, the female, perhaps she's a little on the quieter side, and perhaps her suggestion tends to go overlooked. You could have selection bias at play here. So that means listening to certain voices in the room. So perhaps you're in tune to listening to the same people who tend to speak up all the time in a meeting. So there could be selection bias. Priming bias could be at play here as well. This is, we're used to hearing, we tend to be used to hearing more men speak up than women in meetings. And that is historically what data shows, is that in meetings, men tend to speak in a declamatory voice. They tend to interrupt others more, and they tend to resist being influenced in public. So perhaps you're used to hearing more men speak up, and so when she spoke up, it was unacknowledged. So that's priming bias. And then you mentioned communication. You got that. Could be a communication or language issue, perhaps, or an accent. Maybe it's a cultural issue. Hierarchy, someone mentioned that. And age could be there. So there's a lot of different things going on in this scenario here. So one really important thing to keep in mind is that meetings are the most visible parts of work. And it's the place where we showcase our skills, where we share our ideas and perspectives, but it also can highlight inequities. So meetings, this is usually where we see it, is at meetings. So what would you do in this situation? And I'll go ahead and go to the poll, because I'm really curious to hear how you would react. Okay, I'm going to launch the third poll. Bear with me. Okay, launch poll. So it should be coming up on your screens now. What would you do to address the situation? You wouldn't say anything. So if you were in this meeting and you saw this, you would not say anything. That's one option. Maybe you say something at the meeting. So you would speak up at the meeting itself. Perhaps you say something to the male colleague after the meeting. Maybe you say something to the meeting leader after the meeting, or something else. So take a few seconds to think about that, how you would, and really put yourself in this scenario. How would you act here? How do you think you would respond? I love Arizu, your comment, interrupting is huge. She has a mug that reads, "I'm speaking." It helps. I love that. Thank you. That was recently popularized by Kamala Harris, right? When in the debate.
Yes, it was. I purchased it after that.
I actually did.
And thank you for saying my name right. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. So I love that. I didn't know mugs were available on that saying, but maybe I'll get myself one as well. I love that. Okay, so again, this is an incredibly common, it's a shared global phenomenon, especially for women, but of course, others can experience it too. Okay, let's go ahead and launch the results. Wait till you see this. Oh, about almost 90% of you would say something right then at the meeting. You would speak up. That's excellent that you would do that. It looks like we have an even split between you would not say anything. You would say something to your male colleague after the meeting, or you might say something to the leader of the meeting. But vast majority of you would say something. Okay, so let's talk about this for a moment. Okay, just X out of that. So most of you would say something in the meeting. So let me ask you, first of all, have you experienced this yourself? Has this happened to you? I just kind of want to get a sense from the group on the call right now. Yes, 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 absolutely. Probably to me when I was younger. Okay. Yes, and Nikki, yes, and she's witnessed it all the time. Jennifer sees it at meetings at least once a week, Ellen says. Yes, and I often get talked over. Yes, I was the guy who was given incorrect credit, Paul. He was the guy who was given incorrect credit. That's interesting dynamic going on too. Often, I can't tell you how many times I send the info to my boss to speak for me. Okay, good one. Actually, we're going to talk about that in a moment. Yes, I was told once to keep my mouth shut in the meeting of all men. Interesting. So again, this is incredibly common, but it's an incredibly important scenario because we want all voices to be acknowledged, right? If you want your company and your team to perform optimally, you need to hear from everybody. And if you have this dynamic going on constantly or consistently in your teams, it's going to impact the team morale. It's going to impact even how the leader is perceived. If this type of dynamic is at play all the time and it's not addressed. Okay, so it looks like many of you have experienced it. As I mentioned, it's a shared global phenomenon. Majority of you would say something. Some of you would address it afterwards, which is also appropriate as well. Again, depends on your comfort level. And let me ask you something. Do you need to be the leader of the meeting to speak up? What do you think? Okay, lots of no's coming in. No, but the leader would be helpful. Okay, that was an excellent comment. I saw that fly by. But you do need to be prepared as the leader. Fantastic. Yes, the leader should speak up. The leader should, absolutely, but you don't have to be the leader here. And that's a really important point. If you're in a meeting, especially a meeting that's majority men, you don't have to be the leader. You could speak up and say, hey, she said something, let's go back to that. And so I'm going to give you some verbiage that you could use if you want to in a scenario like this. No, the very definition of meeting is to discuss as a group. Okay, excellent. Everybody should be willing to stand up for a peer. That's from Melissa. So great, Melissa. Great comment. So yeah, let's look at some other strategies other than we know what you already would do. Let's take a look at some others. Okay, one suggestion is you could take notes or whiteboard all comments made. This works really well. So I know many of us are remote right now, but you could still, take notes. And then if a comment was made that gets overlooked, you can go back to it. And when we do meet again, and if you have a whiteboard, someone can just be whiteboarding comments. So very simple way to capture, all the contributions. You could ask for input ahead of time, verbally or in writing, and address it at the meeting. That's going to work particularly well for those who have more introverted preferences. Give them time to think ahead of time about it and maybe tell you about it and have you bring it up, or put it in writing and then have you bring it up, have the leader bring it up. So you could do that. Another thing is you could set ground rules for meeting dynamics. So one ground rule could be that everybody gets floor time. Another ground rule could be that we're going to be respectful and open to other suggestions. Another ground rule is be an active listener, or we want everybody to ask clarifying questions. And my favorite ground rule is have a no interruption policy. You could absolutely do that. I actually met a CEO who has that policy in his meetings. Just no interruption policy. Nobody can interrupt anyone else. So these are very simple things that you can put in place for your team. And then you can also redirect the conversation. So here's the verbiage. You could say, thank you, Jack, for bringing back the suggestion that Nancy made earlier. I agree that Nancy's idea is worth exploring further. Nancy, can you say more about what you had in mind? So just a very simple way to acknowledge it and redirect back. And some of you, you use your own verbiage, of course, but whatever you're comfortable with. But so those are some key things that we could do to address the situation. But I completely agree with what all of you have said, a vast majority of you, that you would speak up the meeting. And it's important that we do that because, again, the longer it goes, it affects the dynamics of the team, and it's going to affect the morale, the engagement. You may have team members that if they see this dynamic, they just will stop speaking up and stop contributing. And so it really wreaks havoc on team dynamics when something like this goes unchecked. So it's really important to, set some ground rules and address the situation when it happens. Okay, so I'm going to give you some more strategies to minimize, other than what we've talked about, to minimize biases. So strategies for individuals. Be honest with yourself about blind spots. We are all biased. We all have biases based on our upbringing, our values, our religion, what we've been taught by our parents, our friends, even the media we watch. So be honest with yourself about blind spots you may have. And the implicit association test that you took actually, gave you some insights into that. Question your first impression. By taking a minute, even just a few seconds to pause and say, wait, is this the reaction I want to be having? Is this consistent with who I am? Just by pausing for a minute, questioning your first impression of someone allows the unconscious to be conscious again. I'll give you another example, another Google example, actually. So I mentioned Google has spent millions on training their managers for unconscious bias training. So there was a group of male engineers, and they were getting ready to interview a female engineer, a female candidate for their team. And before they interviewed her, one of the men spoke up and said, hey guys, let's keep in mind that we may not fully appreciate what this candidate brings to the team. Just by saying that, it was enough to make them aware of biases. Just by saying, hey guys, let's keep in mind we may not be fully aware of what she might bring to the team. Just doing that was enough, again, to bring that awareness. And you know what? She got hired. So that's a real world study, a real world example of, it's very simple, but pausing and just saying something allows it to come to the surface. And then all the men on that team said, oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, we may not have realized, she brings this, this, and this, and this. And she got hired. Hold yourself accountable for your own self-reflection about biases, learning about biases, and evaluating your daily actions. Make a conscious effort to seek others different than you. So you have to be intentional about this because of how we're hardwired, we tend to seek people who are like us. But it may require you to disrupt your normal process. So, who do you, if you work in an office setting, who do you have lunch with all the time? Who's your go-to person that you always call again and again on your team? So someone who works in another department or sits down the hall from you may have the solution to a problem you've been working on. And so you very well may need to disrupt your normal process to seek others different than you. And the reason it's important is because we become familiar with others who are different than us. That builds trust, and trust leads to opportunity. And it's as simple as that. And so the bottom line here is, actually, I'll read you this on the next slide, the bottom line. But having that familiarity with the different creates that trust, and trust leads to opportunity. Okay, here's some strategies for teams. Look at the way your team functions. Are there any in-group or out-group dynamics at play? So are there certain people who are part of the out-group consistently? Are there any patterns of privilege or exclusion going on in the team? And has any person unduly influenced the team's perception of a situation or of an individual? So those are some things to look at as far as your functioning. Remove phrases like the way we've done things in the past, or let's maintain the status quo, or even if it ain't broke, don't fix it. These types of phrases are exclusionary language, and what they signal to other people is, I'm not open, I'm not willing to learn about other ideas or other perspectives. So again, that's language that's more exclusive, not inclusive. Look for dissenting opinions to avoid groupthink. From a team perspective, this is one of the most important things you can do, is actually seek out dissenting opinions. You want people on your team playing devil's advocate. You want people who have different life experiences and different perspectives on for the team to address issues and problems. You want that, because if you have a bunch of like-minded people, it's not going to occur to anybody to think outside the box because they're all like-minded. So you have to seek out differences and different opinions to avoid that group think. And then finally, change the narrative. So include words in your everyday language like respect, kindness, diversity, inclusion, equity. Use these words on your team when you communicate. Let me just check the chat here. Yeah, great. Carrie makes a comment. By seeking out others different from you, it makes your team stronger. They have different strengths and talents. Fantastic comment, Carrie. Okay, great. Now, I also want to share a framework with you. So this in particular is focusing on our colleagues of color and Black colleagues. So this framework is from the Wharton School of Business by Stephanie Creary, and it's called the LEAP framework. So it's a framework on, again, how to work with people of color, particularly Black employees. Listen and learn from colleagues' experiences is the L. Black and other marginalized and intersectional identities feel they must work harder to prove themselves, and they also often feel not heard or understood. So listen and learning is the L. The E is engage with your colleagues in racially diverse and casual settings. Black employees are more likely to open up when they're around other people of color. So we know this from data. The A is ask. Ask about their work goals with curiosity and empathy. So what do they hope to accomplish? How can you help them? What are their concerns? How do you help them reach their goals and their vision? And the P is provide opportunities, suggestions, encouragement, and support for your Black colleagues. Recommend them for opportunities. So this is good news. There's lots you can do. Recommend them for opportunities. You can introduce them to other people. You can provide candid feedback. You can openly acknowledge their accomplishments, so recognition. And if they do share concerns with you, share those challenges and concerns with HR and leadership so they have an awareness. So I like this framework a lot. It's real simple, the LEAP framework, to address racism. And here's the bottom line. We will only change systemic biases when we intentionally challenge and change the structures that create inequality at work, including who we support and how we support them. Okay, so next steps. Start the dialogue about bias at your company. I know you all work at different companies, but starting the discussions is important. Commit to making a conscious decision to be mindful of bias and commit to being more inclusive in your behaviors. Here's a phrase for you, and you might want to write it down. It's one of the best phrases that I use it often. It's the best phrases I've heard. If you're not, so I said, make a conscious decision to be mindful and commit to being inclusive. If you're not intentionally including others, you're probably accidentally excluding others. So I'll say that again. If you're not intentionally including other people, you're probably excluding or accidentally excluding other people. So we have to be intentional about this, about being inclusive. Support is seek support and guidance from each other, HR, and your leadership teams. We're all going through this together. And likely, hopefully, your company has some policies in place against bias, discrimination. And if not, then absolutely bring up the subject and speak to them about that. So seek support and guidance from each other and from leadership. And then finally, implement at least one of these bias strategies. So we talked about many strategies today with the scenarios. I provided additional strategies for individuals and teams, and then also the racism framework. So with that, I want to leave you with a quote. Do you know who said this? Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. Who do you think that is? Let's see who's the first to get it. Sherry, your last name Begun. Looks like Sherry Begun. Maya Angelou, you are absolutely correct. A lot of people, Ross says nice. A lot of people guess, others, Albert Einstein and other people, but that is a quote not often attributed to Maya Angelou, but it's absolutely appropriate when it comes to bias. So with that, thank you all for your time today. I'll leave you with my contact information. I would be happy to connect with you on social, LinkedIn, Twitter. LinkedIn's probably best. If you have any questions, here's my email, Shawn@drshawnandrews.com. And then also I have a free download on my website if you're interested. It's a 25-page Power of Perception workbook. And there's my book. The workbook mirrors every chapter of the book, including bias, including the topics we've talked about today. And so that's a free download on my website if you're interested. So with that, I wish you all the best of luck in your bias journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Shawn. This was awesome. And for those of you on call, hold on real quick. I just want to thank you, Shawn. I also wanted to send everybody a message letting them know, for those of people who couldn't get on today, we sincerely apologize. Please, let everyone know this will be a recording that is accessible to everybody later. So we apologize for that last minute glitch, but we proceeded on. Shawn, that was a great session. Everybody learned a lot, and thank you for being here. So we look forward to seeing you at your next session. So if you go to the hub and you click on your breakout session, there was 3 sessions. So you were able to register for one of them, but even if you changed your mind at the last moment, it's okay. So you have Graham Kilshaw, you have Cecilia Gorman, and you have Gina Feely coming up. So you attend one of those sessions, take which one you want, and we will see you at 10:45 Pacific time. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of the conference.